7 months after the divorce, the Mafia Boss gets a call: "I need money to buy a baby formula." The silence in Lorenzo Moretti's office had a weight to it. The kind that seeps into the bones and makes every breath feel like a confession. 7 months had crawled by since he signed the divorce papers, yet the ghost of that moment lingered in every corner of his mansion. The ink might have dried, but the pain never did. He'd built his empire on ruthlessness, commanding men with a single glance. But he couldn't command his own heart to forget her, Elena Rossi. The woman who once dared to love the devil and left him because even her heart couldn't survive the darkness he carried. He told himself it was for the best, that she was safer away from him, away from the blood and secrets that painted his world. But tonight, as he sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the city lights beyond the glass, he realized how hollow power felt when there was no one to come home to. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the glass of whiskey, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of pretending he didn't care. The amber liquid reflected the room's muted glow, a silent witness to his loneliness. Every sound, the ticking clock, the hum of the night outside, seemed amplified against the emptiness inside him. Then, the shrill vibration of his phone sliced through the stillness. He blinked once, frowning, reaching for it out of habit more than curiosity. But when his eyes landed on the screen, the world seemed to narrow down to a single name: Elena. His breath hitched, the glass slipping slightly in his grip. For a moment, he thought it was a hallucination, some cruel trick of a heart that refused to heal. He hadn't heard her voice in months, hadn't seen her since she walked out that rainy afternoon without looking back. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what he'd say if she ever called again, how he'd sound composed, cold, detached. But when he answered, all that practiced control vanished the second her voice trembled through the speaker. "Lorenzo. I need money. For baby formula." The words hit him like a knife between the ribs. For a second, he didn't understand. He sat there frozen, the phone pressed to his ear, every part of him tense. Baby formula. The phrase echoed inside his mind, distant and disbelieving, like a foreign language he couldn't translate. His throat went dry. Baby formula? He repeated softly, as if saying it again might change its meaning. He leaned forward, his hand gripping the edge of the desk, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Elena, do you have a child?" The silence that followed stretched into eternity. He could hear her breathing, uneven, broken, and each sound stabbed through him like a reminder of everything he'd lost. Then came the faint sound of her sobs, raw and uncontrollable, before the line went dead. For a long time, Lorenzo didn't move. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the desk. His mind spiraled, trying to grasp what had just happened. A child? Her child? His child? The possibilities collided in his head like waves against stone, leaving him hollow and trembling. He stood slowly, pacing to the window, staring at the city below, the empire he had sacrificed everything for. He'd once believed that love was a distraction, that it made men weak. But now, faced with the possibility that somewhere out there, Elena might be holding a child, maybe his child, the man who had ruled New York's underworld suddenly felt powerless. Memories flooded him, sharp and vivid, Elena's laughter echoing through the old villa. Her eyes filled with warmth even when she was angry at him. The way she'd press her hand against his chest when she wanted to calm the storm inside him. He had told her once that he didn't need children, that his world was no place for innocence. Now, those words came back to haunt him. What if that child existed because she had carried a piece of him she couldn't bear to destroy? What if she had chosen silence all these months because she wanted to protect that tiny life from the blood on his hands? The thought tore through him. He sank back into the leather chair, rubbing his face with his palms, the burn of whiskey still lingering on his tongue. For years, he'd ruled by fear, but tonight fear ruled him. Fear of what he'd become. Fear of what he might have lost. The name Elena echoed in his chest like a prayer he no longer deserved to say. He replayed her voice in his mind, the tremor, the desperation, the exhaustion, and realized she must have been suffering for a long time before she reached out to him. She had always been proud, too proud to ask for anything, especially from him. For her to call meant she had no one else left. That realization cut deeper than any betrayal. He wanted to call her back, to demand answers, to hear her voice again, but his hands refused to move. He stared at the phone as though it were a weapon, capable of destroying what little sanity he had left. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. The shadows seemed to press against him, whispering all the things he'd done to drive her away. Outside, thunder rumbled distantly, and the reflection in the window looked nothing like a king of crime, just a lonely man who'd built his own prison out of pride. Somewhere in that vast city, Elena was alone, possibly with a child in her arms, and he was here, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt meaningless. For the first time in his life, Lorenzo Moretti felt something he didn't know how to fight, regret so deep it made breathing hurt. Lorenzo sat there long after the line went dead. The echo of Elena's sobs looping inside his skull until it felt like the sound itself might split him open. And in that empty office, his supposed throne room, everything he'd built began to feel like a mausoleum made of marble and gilt. The desk that had once held blueprints for power now looked cluttered with meaningless objects, contracts, cigars, polished pens, all symbols of control that couldn't fix the single thing that mattered. He tried to tell himself this was nothing, a misunderstanding, a moment of weakness on her part, but his heart rejected every lie faster than his mind could form it. He could still hear the quiver in her breath, the way her words trembled between pride and desperation. It wasn't money she wanted, not really, it was help, and it killed him to know she'd reached the point of asking the one man who had ruined her peace. His thoughts turned inward like knives. He remembered that night 7 months ago when they'd stood in the lawyer's office, the air thick with silence, her wedding ring lying on the table like a piece of evidence in a crime. She hadn't cried. She'd simply looked at him with those steady eyes that once could melt steel and whispered, "You'll never change, Lorenzo." He'd wanted to argue, to tell her he was trying, but the truth was, he hadn't been. He'd been consumed by the endless chase for respect in a world where love was a weakness and mercy a liability. Now, the irony twisted inside him, all the power he'd fought for couldn't reach her through a disconnected phone line. He rose and walked toward the fireplace, lighting it out of habit more than comfort. Flames flickered across his face, reflecting in his eyes like memories he wished he could burn away. "Baby formula," he muttered under his breath, testing the words again as though repetition would make them logical. If she had a child, then whose was it? The question rose like smoke, curling around his mind, suffocating reason. Could she have moved on that quickly? Could someone else be holding her at night, whispering to her the promises he'd broken? The thought was unbearable. Yet underneath the jealousy was something darker, fear. Because if the child was his, then Elena had been carrying their secret alone for months, surviving without him, without his protection. That realization made his chest ache in a way no bullet ever could. He gripped the mantel with both hands, his knuckles whitening as he stared into the fire. He had men who would kill for him, money that could buy silence in any courtroom, but he had no idea how to fix this. For a moment, he imagined himself driving to her, appearing at her door like some ghost begging for redemption. But he could also imagine the look on her face, tired, wary, maybe even afraid. He had terrified her once, not with violence, but with the world that followed him. He'd sworn to keep her away from it, and now fate seemed to mock that vow. His mind dragged him back to the first time he'd heard her laugh, a tiny cafe on the Lower East Side, rain dripping from her hair as she scolded him for trying to pay for everyone's meal. She'd told him, "Money doesn't make you noble, Lorenzo. Your choices do." And what had he done with that wisdom? Turned it into dust. The clock on the wall struck midnight, its chime hollow. He sank into the chair again, staring at the phone like it was a detonator. He wanted to call her back, to say he didn't care about the past, that he'd send her whatever she needed, that he'd come to her himself, but he also knew words from him might make things worse. She had hung up, not because she didn't want him, but because she couldn't bear to let him in. That silence between them now felt sacred and unbearable. He poured another drink, but this time didn't raise it to his lips. The scent of whiskey reminded him too much of every night he'd drowned in regret. He turned the glass upside down, letting it spill across the desk, watching the amber trail snake its way toward the edge and drip to the floor. "What have you done, Lorenzo?" he whispered to himself. Outside, the rain began to fall, gentle at first, then heavier, beating against the windows in uneven rhythm, like the pulse of his conscience. He leaned back and closed his eyes, trying to conjure her face. But all he could see were those tears he'd never wiped away. Somewhere in the city, the woman who once tamed his chaos was alone, asking him for help because there was no one else left. For the first time in his life, he didn't know whether to pray for strength or forgiveness, or whether he even deserved either. All he knew was that tomorrow would come, and with it, a decision that could either redeem him or break him completely. The night after the call stretched into a kind of sleepless haze for Lorenzo, each hour passing with the dull ache of uncertainty gnawing at his chest. And by dawn, he knew he couldn't live another day without answers. He had spent years commanding information, names, movements, betrayals, so it took only one order for his men to begin searching for her. But this was different. This wasn't business, this was desperation disguised as control. He watched them move around his office, giving updates, tracing records, and all he could think about was that trembling voice asking for baby formula. By the third day, one of his men came forward with an address, scribbled hastily on a torn piece of paper, a forgotten street near the city's edge, a place where his empire's shadow didn't reach. Lorenzo dismissed everyone, took the keys to his car, and drove himself. The city looked different now, colder, smaller, like the world had been stripped of its arrogance. Every red light felt like a punishment, every reflection in the glass a reminder of the man he had become. When he reached the building, it stood like something time had abandoned: cracked walls, rusted balconies, windows covered with cheap curtains to hide the kind of life people didn't want others to see. He hesitated at the entrance, a man who once ordered lives with a gesture now too afraid to knock on a door. The hallway smelled of dampness and old dreams. His shoes echoed softly against the broken tiles as he climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When he reached her door, he stopped, listening. For a moment, he heard nothing but silence, then a faint sound, a baby's muffled cry. It pierced through him like sunlight through smoke. He raised his hand and knocked once. The sound seemed to linger forever before the latch clicked, and the door opened slowly. Elena stood there, and the sight of her made his throat close. She was thinner, her hair pulled back messily, her face pale, her eyes tired but still holding that stubborn spark he had fallen in love with. But it wasn't her frailty that destroyed him, it was what she held in her arms. The baby stirred, wrapped in a faded blanket, his small hands twitching, his breath soft and uneven. And then Lorenzo saw the eyes, green, bright, familiar in a way that cut through every lie he had ever told himself. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world shrank to the space between them. "Is he mine?" The words escaped before he even realized he'd spoken. Elena's lips trembled. Tears welled up, and she looked down at the child as if gathering strength from him. "I didn't want your world touching him," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of exhaustion. "But I couldn't survive alone anymore." Those words hit him harder than any bullet could. All the power he'd hoarded, all the money, all the control, none of it had protected her. His chest felt tight, guilt creeping through every heartbeat. He stepped forward slowly, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. She didn't stop him. He sank to one knee before her, his hands shaking as he reached out toward the child. When his fingers brushed the baby's tiny hand, warmth spread through him, foreign, terrifying, real. The baby's hand curled around his finger, instinctive, trusting, and something inside Lorenzo shattered. For the first time in years, the Mafia Boss felt small, human, fragile. He lifted his gaze to Elena, and in her eyes, he saw the woman who had once been his home, the one who had believed in him before he believed in himself. There were no words left, no excuses, no claims of redemption, only silence thick with everything they couldn't say. The baby let out a small sound, a sleepy whimper, and Lorenzo felt tears sting his own eyes. He had never cried in front of anyone, not since he was a boy watching his father die, but now he couldn't stop the burn behind his eyes. The air between them pulsed with years of love, anger, and unfinished sentences. He wanted to tell her that he would fix everything, that he would take care of them both, but something inside him knew this wasn't the moment for promises. She didn't need a savior. She needed peace. And he, the man who destroyed everything he touched, had no right to offer it. Still, as he knelt there, his finger trapped in the soft grasp of his son, he couldn't deny it, he made a silent vow. Whatever it cost, he would not fail them again. The sound of the baby's breathing filled the quiet apartment, steady and fragile, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the slowing beat of Lorenzo's heart. He looked around the room, bare walls, a second-hand crib, a pot on the stove barely steaming, and guilt anchored itself deep inside him. She had been living like this while he sat in marble halls. And yet she still carried that same quiet dignity, the strength that had always terrified him because he could never break it. He wanted to speak, to say something that might undo even a fraction of the hurt he'd caused, but when he opened his mouth, nothing came. Words seemed useless now. So he just stayed there, silent, grounded by the weight of a truth he couldn't run from anymore, the truth that power had cost him everything real. And love had found its way back to him not as forgiveness, but as consequence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. As if sound itself might shatter the fragile space between them, and Lorenzo stayed kneeling, unable to look away from the small miracle resting in Elena's arms. The baby had quieted, his tiny breaths creating a rhythm that made the whole room feel alive. And Lorenzo found himself memorizing every detail, the soft curve of the child's cheek, the faint coo that escaped his lips, the tiny fist still gripping his finger as if anchoring him to something pure. It was strange, that feeling of stillness. He had lived his whole life in motion, chasing, conquering, commanding, and now, in this dim apartment that smelled of milk and quiet survival, the world finally stopped spinning. Elena shifted slightly, her movements slow and cautious, and Lorenzo could see how fatigue had carved itself into her face, how her beauty now carried the exhaustion of sleepless nights and too many sacrifices. She wasn't the woman who used to wear silk and laugh against the wind on his penthouse balcony. She was something far braver, a mother protecting her child from the wreckage he had left behind. The realization cut deep. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered finally, her tone more weary than angry, but the sound of his name unspoken between her words made his throat tighten. He wanted to tell her that he hadn't been able to stay away, that ever since that phone call, he had been walking through ghosts, haunted by every choice that led her here. Instead, he said nothing. His silence was heavier than words, filled with everything he was too afraid to say. He rose slowly, and the movement seemed to startle her. She took a step back, clutching the baby instinctively, and that small action hurt more than any betrayal he'd known. He had become a man she needed to protect her child from. "I'm not here to hurt you," he managed, his voice rough, quieter than usual, as though even he didn't trust it. "I just needed to see you." Elena's eyes softened, but her jaw remained set. "Seeing isn't helping," she said. "You have a world behind you that destroys everything it touches. I can't let it touch him." The word "him" felt like a confession, like a quiet acceptance of the truth they'd both been avoiding. Lorenzo's gaze dropped to the baby again, and he felt an ache bloom in his chest that he didn't know how to contain. "I can protect you," he said before he could stop himself, but even as he said it, he knew how hollow it sounded. Protect. That was what he always said before he made things worse. She shook her head, her voice calm, almost gentle. "You can't protect what you don't understand, Lorenzo. And you don't understand peace." That line landed in him like a blade turned slow. He wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she was right. Peace was a language he'd never learned, and love, real love, had always been something he tried to buy instead of nurture. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't empty. The baby began to stir, fussing softly, and Elena rocked him instinctively, her eyes softening as she hummed a tune so faint it felt like a secret. Lorenzo watched her, realizing he'd never seen her more beautiful. It wasn't the kind of beauty that dazzled, it was the kind that endured. Something inside him broke open then, a slow, painful recognition of everything he had missed, everything he had destroyed. Without thinking, he reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, thick with cash. "Take this," he said. "It's not about control, Elena. Just let me help." She didn't reach for it. Her eyes flickered toward the envelope, then back to him, filled with quiet defiance. "Money didn't save me then, and it won't save me now." Her words were calm but carried the weight of years of disappointment. He nodded slowly, lowering his hand, realizing that this time, his power meant nothing. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to offer. All he could do was stand there, surrounded by the ghost of their love and the proof of it breathing softly in her arms. He took a slow breath, his voice trembling as he whispered, "He has your strength." Elena looked down at the baby and smiled faintly, a tiny, fragile smile that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "And your eyes," she said softly, not as an accusation but as acknowledgement. The words hit him like mercy. He wanted to step closer, to hold them both, but something in her expression, fear, or maybe memory, kept him still. He understood then that redemption wasn't a door he could walk through whenever he wished. It was something she would have to open, and he had already given her too many reasons to keep it locked. He took one last look around the apartment, the cracked paint, the single lamp, the small stack of unpaid bills on the counter, and then his gaze returned to her. "I'll make sure you're safe," he said quietly, and this time it wasn't a command. It was a promise made with humility, with love stripped of pride. She didn't answer, but her silence didn't feel like rejection, it felt like cautious hope. As he turned to leave, the baby's faint cry followed him to the door, and he paused, closing his eyes for a moment as the sound filled the hollow space in his chest. When he stepped back into the hallway, the air felt colder, the world sharper, but something inside him had changed. For the first time in years, Lorenzo Moretti wasn't thinking like a king or a killer. He was thinking like a father. And that realization, fragile and terrifying, burned brighter than any fire he'd ever known. When Lorenzo stepped out of that apartment, the night air felt heavier, as though the city itself could sense the shift inside him. The man who once measured his worth in fear and loyalty now carried a quieter burden, the fragile heartbeat of a child who didn't even know his name. For days, he couldn't think of anything else but the image of Elena's worn face and the baby's tiny fingers curling around his own. The guilt was unbearable, but beneath it flickered something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He spent nights pacing his office, every instinct screaming to protect what was his. Protection, that was all he knew how to do. But this time it wasn't about territory or business. This was about them. By the end of the week, he had found a place, a secluded villa far beyond the city's noise, a home surrounded by olive trees and silence, a place untouched by the shadows of his world. He didn't ask her to move. He told her it was already arranged. He could tell she didn't trust the gesture, but he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet surrender that came from having no better choice. When she finally agreed, something inside him eased, though her acceptance felt more like mercy than reconciliation. The day she moved in, he followed her there, not as the boss of men but as a man trying to make amends. The villa was warm and quiet, filled with the kind of peace that always eluded him. Elena moved through the rooms with the baby in her arms, inspecting every corner, and Lorenzo watched her in silence, afraid that if he spoke, he might break the illusion that he belonged there. He stocked the kitchen with her favorite foods, left envelopes of money on the counter, and even arranged guards outside the property though she had begged him not to. She said she didn't want soldiers near her son. He called them watchers instead. Every day he came by with something: flowers, new clothes for the baby, sometimes just a story to tell. But each time, Elena's distance felt like a wall he couldn't climb. She was polite, kind even, but there was no warmth behind her eyes. Once, when he brought a silver rattle engraved with the baby's initials, she took it silently and placed it on a shelf, untouched. He stood there awkwardly, unsure whether to be angry or ashamed. "You can't buy forgiveness, Lorenzo," she said softly one night as he set down another box of groceries. Her tone wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of truth. He looked at her, her hair undone, shadows of fatigue under her eyes, and for the first time, he didn't try to defend himself. "I don't want forgiveness," he said quietly. "I just want to make sure my son never goes hungry again." The word son caught in his throat, unfamiliar yet powerful. Elena looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, he saw something flicker in her gaze, maybe understanding, maybe pity. It was enough to keep him coming back. But peace, he knew, was a fragile illusion in his world, and even as he tried to build this small corner of safety for them, the streets whispered. Men talked. Rumors spread faster than bullets, and soon, his enemies learned that the untouchable Lorenzo Moretti had found something, or someone, to lose. The first sign came quietly. One morning, a black envelope was slipped under his office door. No markings, no seal. Inside, a single note typed in red ink: "The Moretti bloodline will end with him." His hands went cold as he read it, the paper trembling between his fingers. He stared at the words until they blurred. For the first time in years, fear, not for himself, but for another, settled deep into his bones. He had always known the cost of power, but he had never imagined it would come for a child. He burned the note in his ashtray, watching the edges curl into black smoke, but the words stayed etched in his mind like scars. That night, he drove back to the villa, every mile filled with dread. When he arrived, he didn't tell Elena. She looked too peaceful, sitting by the fireplace, the baby asleep in her arms. He stood at the doorway, watching them like a man staring at something sacred. He had spilled blood to protect meaningless possessions, but now he understood what it meant to truly have something worth dying for. He walked outside and called his men, his voice low, dangerous. "No one touches that villa," he said. "No one even breathes near it." And when he hung up, he looked up at the night sky, the stars faint behind the clouds, and whispered a promise to the child he hadn't yet dared to hold again: "They'll have to go through me first." The world he had built on control was slipping into chaos again. But this time, the stakes were higher. He had created a past filled with enemies. Now that past was coming back with teeth. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and guilt, there was a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, Lorenzo Moretti knew exactly what he was fighting for, and it wasn't power, or territory, or pride. It was love, fragile and unspoken, wrapped in the arms of the only woman who had ever seen the man beneath the monster. The moment Lorenzo saw that threat, something old and terrible began to stir inside him, a version of himself he had tried to bury when he first saw his son's face. For 7 months he had lived in silence, and in that silence he had almost convinced himself that he could walk away from the life he built out of blood. But fear has a way of resurrecting the dead, and that night, every buried instinct came clawing to the surface. He sat in his car outside the villa, cigarette trembling between his fingers, staring at the faint light coming from the window where Elena rocked their son to sleep. Every flicker of the lamp against her silhouette reminded him how fragile this peace was, how easily it could vanish. He wanted to go inside, to tell her about the message, to promise that nothing would happen. But what good were promises from a man who had built an empire of lies? So he stayed there, motionless, watching, guarding, fighting the war inside his chest. He thought of the men who might come for them, the rivals whose brothers he had buried, the ghosts of all the lives he had ruined. Every one of them had a reason to strike, and now, they finally knew how to hurt him. The next morning, he called his most trusted men, Marco, Salvatore, and Luca, the ones who had been with him since the beginning, the ones who knew loyalty wasn't a choice but a bond sealed in blood. They gathered in his study, tension thick in the air. "Someone knows," he said, his voice low but cold. "Someone knows about the boy." The men exchanged glances, their faces pale, because they understood what that meant. The boss they once feared was no longer untouchable. "Find them," Lorenzo ordered. "I don't care what it takes." But beneath the fury in his tone was something his men had never heard before: desperation. He wasn't fighting to protect an empire anymore. He was fighting to protect his heart. That night, he couldn't bring himself to sleep. The clock ticked past midnight as he sat in the villa's garden, the scent of wet grass and cigarette smoke mixing in the cold air. From inside, he could hear faint lullabies, Elena's voice, soft and tired, singing to the baby. He closed his eyes, letting that sound cut through the chaos in his head. For the first time, he realized how much peace he had missed. When the singing stopped, the door creaked open, and Elena stepped outside. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, her hair loose, eyes half filled with questions. "You shouldn't be out here," she said quietly. "You'll scare the neighbors." Lorenzo almost smiled, but it faded quickly. "There are no neighbors," he murmured. "And the only ones who should be scared are the people who think they can touch you." She frowned, sensing the storm in his tone. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steady but soft. He wanted to lie, to tell her it was nothing. But his eyes betrayed him. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said finally, looking away. "Just ghosts reminding me who I am." She studied him for a moment, the man she once loved, now cracked open by something deeper than guilt. "You can't keep fighting your past forever," she whispered. "Eventually, it'll find you." Her words sank deep, and he looked at her then, really looked at her, the woman who had every reason to hate him but still cared enough to warn him. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but this time, I'll be ready." Days turned into restless nights. His men worked in shadows, tracing rumors, intercepting whispers in alleys and bars, but the threat remained invisible. Each night, Lorenzo parked near the villa, hidden under the cloak of darkness, watching the faint glow of the nursery window. Sometimes, he'd see Elena pacing with the baby in her arms, and it tore at him, knowing she was forced to live with fear again because of his sins. He had promised her peace, yet all he brought was danger wearing a new face. One evening, as rain began to fall, he sat in his car, listening to the soft patter on the windshield, and thought about his father, a man he barely remembered but whose words had once echoed through the halls of his memory. "A man without something to lose is a dangerous man. But a man with something to protect is unstoppable." He finally understood. The empire he had built wasn't strength, it was armor. But now, his strength was the fragile family inside that house, the ones who made him human again. The following morning, Salvatore returned with a lead. A rival family, the De Lucas, had been asking questions about a woman and a child connected to Moretti. They wanted proof, leverage, weakness. Lorenzo's rage burned so fiercely that his men stepped back without a word. He didn't shout. He didn't break things. He simply whispered, "End it." And that whisper was enough to set chaos in motion. Within hours, his men swept through the city, pulling strings, erasing threats, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. Yet even as he watched the danger recede, Lorenzo felt no victory. The blood he spilled that day felt different, colder, heavier. He had always justified his violence as business, but now, every drop felt personal. That night, he returned to the villa, soaked from rain, and stood outside the nursery. Inside, Elena was asleep in a chair, the baby resting against her chest, both breathing in unison. He watched them through the glass, his reflection merging with theirs, the monster and the family he didn't deserve. And in that quiet moment, as thunder rumbled in the distance, he made a silent vow: "If the past wants me, it can have me. But it will never have them." The storm outside raged on, but inside his chest, something fragile and pure flickered alive, the kind of love that even death would have to kneel before. The storm came without warning. A restless growl that rolled through the black sky and rattled the windows of the villa like a bad omen. Lorenzo had been pacing his study all evening, the weight of unease pressing against his ribs, a feeling that something was about to break. He'd learned to trust that feeling, it had saved his life more times than he could count. But tonight it wasn't his life he was worried about, It was theirs. The sound of rain turned heavier, like the city itself was trying to wash away its sins, and somewhere in that noise, his phone rang. Marco's voice came through, tense and urgent. "Boss, we found them. 4 men, armed. Heading toward the villa." For a second, Lorenzo didn't breathe. Every fear he had been swallowing for weeks suddenly turned real. He looked toward the nursery door upstairs where he could hear the faint hum of the baby's breathing monitor, and a cold calm settled over him. "Keep them away from the house," he said, his tone sharp and measured, though his pulse thundered beneath his skin. "No survivors." He hung up before Marco could respond. The world outside flashed white with lightning, and in that split second of brightness, he saw his reflection in the window, an aging man with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. A father standing at the crossroads between redemption and ruin. He moved through the house silently, every step deliberate. Elena met him in the hallway, her face pale, fear glistening in her eyes. She didn't need to ask what was happening. She saw it in his expression. "Lorenzo?" she whispered. "Go upstairs. Pack a bag. Take him. You're leaving now." She shook her head, panic breaking through her voice. "No, you're scaring me. Tell me what's, Elena?" he snapped, his voice cracking not with anger but terror. She froze, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. "Please," he said softer, his tone unraveling. "Take the baby and go. Marco's men will get you to the safe house." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told her everything. Without another word, she ran upstairs, and he followed her halfway before stopping at the top step. He watched her scoop up their son, still sleeping, unaware of the chaos that was about to erupt around him. Lorenzo wanted to hold him, just once more, but he didn't. He couldn't afford that weakness. When they reached the door, Elena turned to him. "What about you?" she asked, clutching the baby close. Rain pounded against the glass, thunder shook the walls. "I'll stay," he said. "This ends tonight." She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, he pressed a hand against her cheek. "Go," he whispered. "Before they find us." And then she was gone, swallowed by the storm, escorted by shadows he trusted more than himself. When the sound of their car faded, the silence that followed was deafening. Lorenzo stood alone in the darkened villa, the air thick with the scent of gun oil and fear. He walked to the fireplace, took out his pistol, and checked the magazine. His mind was strangely clear, like the eye of a hurricane. He wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. He was thinking about love, about how something so pure could grow out of a life so poisoned. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. The trembling in his hands made the glass rattle against the table. Outside, headlights flashed through the rain. The moment had come. He moved toward the door, the weight of the gun cold in his palm, and when he stepped into the storm, it felt almost peaceful. His men were already there, crouched behind cars, weapons drawn. The hitmen had arrived, 4 shadows slipping through the darkness, faces hidden beneath dripping hoods. Lorenzo could smell the danger in the air, the electric hum before the first shot. "Wait for my signal," he whispered into his radio, then stepped forward. He wasn't a boss now. He was a father defending his blood. The first bullet shattered the silence. It missed him by inches, splintering the wooden gate behind him. His men returned fire, flashes of light tearing through the rain. The world turned into chaos, mud, thunder, blood, and smoke blending into one violent blur. Lorenzo moved like instinct, his body remembering every lesson the streets had ever taught him. He ducked behind a car, fired twice, heard one man drop. He felt a sting on his arm, warm blood seeping through his sleeve, but he didn't stop. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Marco shouted his name, but he couldn't hear over the roar of his heartbeat. He saw the last man running toward the house, and something primal tore out of him. He sprinted through the mud, tackled the man to the ground, and pressed the gun beneath his jaw. "Who sent you?" he growled, rain dripping from his hair into his eyes. The man's voice shook. "DeLuca?" Said the baby's the weakness? Said to end the bloodline. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the valley, swallowed by thunder. When the shooting stopped, silence returned, heavy, final. The rain slowed, turning from violence to drizzle, washing the blood into the earth. Lorenzo stood there, chest heaving, soaked and bleeding, the pistol dangling from his hand. Around him, his men moved like ghosts, checking bodies, whispering in low voices. He looked toward the empty road where Elena's car had disappeared and felt something hollow open inside him. He had won the battle, but victory felt meaningless. Every drop of blood spilled tonight would follow him for the rest of his life. Marco approached, breathless, face streaked with mud. "It's done," he said quietly. "They won't be coming back." Lorenzo nodded, his voice barely audible. "They always come back," he murmured. The rain washed down his face, mixing with something else, something he hadn't felt since the night she left him. It wasn't relief. It was sorrow. And as lightning lit the sky one last time, he realized what this storm had truly taken from him, the last piece of peace he would ever know. The rain had stopped by the time the sun began to rise. But the world still smelled of gunpowder and loss. Lorenzo stood on the gravel path outside the villa. His shirt torn and soaked through, blood seeping from the wound on his side. But he barely felt it, the adrenaline had faded, leaving only the ache of silence. Smoke still lingered in the air, thin wisps curling above the ground like the spirits of the men who had died here. His men moved quietly, gathering weapons, loading bodies into vans, speaking in hushed voices out of respect, for him, for what had just happened. But Lorenzo barely noticed them. His eyes were fixed on the gate where Elena's car had vanished hours earlier, where his last glimpse of her had been a blur of headlights and rain. He replayed that moment again and again in his mind, the look in her eyes when she turned to ask if he was coming with them, the way his hand had lingered on her face before he told her to go. He'd told himself he stayed to protect them. That was the truth. But it was also because he didn't know how to be the man who left. He had been a shield for so long, he didn't know how to live once the fight was over. He walked back toward the villa, boots heavy in the wet earth, and paused at the door. The house was quiet, too quiet. Inside, the walls bore the marks of gunfire, splintered wood, cracked glass, the lingering echo of violence. He stepped into the living room, where the fire had long gone cold, and for a moment, he felt like a ghost wandering through the ruins of his own life. He sat down heavily on the couch, the leather sticking to his damp clothes, and stared at his hands. They were trembling, not from pain, but from the weight of what he had done. These hands had built an empire. These hands had destroyed men, signed death warrants, held power like it was a birthright. But tonight, they had done something different. They had protected love. And somehow, that felt heavier than all the sins that came before it. Marco entered quietly, his expression grim but respectful. "The cleanup's done, boss," he said. "DeLuca's men won't be a problem anymore. The message is clear." Lorenzo didn't look up. "Messages don't matter anymore," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They'll keep coming. They always do." Marco hesitated, then nodded, knowing better than to argue. He stood by the doorway for a long moment before saying, "You should get that wound checked." Lorenzo looked down, realizing for the first time that his side was soaked with blood. "Later," he said softly. Marco gave him one last look before leaving him alone again. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like the final note of a requiem. The pain began to settle in, sharp and relentless, but he didn't move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the baby's silver rattle, the one he had given Elena weeks ago, the one she had never used. He didn't remember putting it there. Maybe he had picked it up in a daze before the fight, or maybe fate had placed it there to remind him why he was still breathing. He turned it over in his palm, the metal cool against his skin, and for a brief moment, the hardened boss of New York felt like a broken man sitting in the ashes of his own kingdom. He could still hear Elena's voice from that night when she told him he couldn't buy forgiveness. She had been right. He couldn't. But maybe he could earn peace, if not for himself, then for them. The wind outside began to pick up again, carrying the faint scent of rain and gun smoke. Lorenzo rose slowly, every movement heavy with pain. He walked toward the nursery, the one Elena had painted pale blue, the one that had never known the sound of laughter. The crib was empty now, the blanket folded neatly over the edge. He placed the silver rattle inside, next to the small stuffed bear he had bought on a whim, and stood there for a long time, staring at the space where his son had slept. The silence was unbearable. He pressed a hand to his wound, not to stop the bleeding but to remind himself that he was still alive, that the pain was real. Then he whispered, barely audible, "It's over now." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. Nothing was ever over in his world. As dawn crept through the broken windows, turning the floor to golden crimson, Lorenzo walked outside one last time. The city stretched out far in the distance, still asleep, unaware of the war that had just ended and the man who had traded part of his soul for the fragile safety of a child. Marco's car was waiting at the gate, the engine running, ready to take him to a safe house or a doctor or anywhere that wasn't here. But Lorenzo didn't move toward it. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the light met the fog, and thought of Elena holding their son, safe for now, somewhere beyond his reach. The thought both comforted and destroyed him. He had done what he promised, he had protected them. But in doing so, he had lost something he could never reclaim. The wound in his side throbbed harder, and his vision began to blur. He leaned against the gatepost, breathing slowly, the smell of wet earth filling his lungs. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard a baby's cry echoing faintly, carried by the wind, though he knew it was only in his mind. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him like a prayer. If this is the price of love, he thought, then let me pay it. The world around him dimmed, but in that darkness, he found a strange peace. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just the quiet truth that, for once, he had fought for something pure. When Marco's voice called out again, faint and urgent, Lorenzo straightened, wiped the blood from his hand, and took one last look at the villa before walking toward the car. The storm had passed, but inside him, the thunder would never stop. The sterile white light of the hospital ceiling flickered above him, sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the haze that wrapped around Lorenzo's mind like smoke. The first thing he felt was pain, dull and heavy, pulsing through every inch of his body. The second was the smell, antiseptic and iron, the scent of blood and disinfectant blending into something that made his stomach twist. For a long time, he didn't know where he was. He only knew he wasn't dead, and part of him wished he didn't have to open his eyes to confirm it. The world came back to him in fragments, the echo of rain on the window, the faint beeping of a heart monitor, the low murmur of voices beyond the door. And then, like a whisper breaking through fog, he heard her. Elena. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room, soft and trembling, and in that moment, it was the only sound that mattered. He opened his eyes slowly, the world coming into focus like a photograph emerging from darkness. She stood at the foot of his bed, her hair damp from the storm, her face pale and streaked with tears. For a heartbeat, he thought he was dreaming again, that his guilt had conjured her one last time. But then she moved toward him, and the tremor in her hands was real. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw, his voice a cracked whisper. Elena. She stopped beside him, her breath shaking. Why? She asked, her words breaking, not with anger but grief. After everything you did? After everything I tried to escape? Why would you risk your life for us? Lorenzo's gaze drifted toward the window, where the early morning light was just beginning to break through the clouds. The storm had passed, but inside him, it still raged. He swallowed hard, the movement painful. Because losing you once destroyed me, he said finally, his voice barely more than air. Losing my son? Would have ended me. The truth hung between them, raw and heavy. He hadn't planned the words. They had simply escaped, stripped of pride, stripped of the armor he had worn for years. Elena pressed a trembling hand against her mouth, her eyes shining with tears that refused to fall. She looked at him like she was seeing someone she didn't recognize, a man without power, without control, without the walls that had kept her out. He wanted to reach for her, but the four in his arm pulled tight, a reminder of how fragile he had become. She stepped closer, her movements hesitant, and finally took his hand. The warmth of her touch burned through him, and he felt something inside his chest crack open, something that had been locked away since the day she left. "You're a fool," she whispered, her voice trembling as a tear slipped down her cheek. "You could have died." He tried to smile, but it hurt too much. "Then it would have been worth it." For a long time, they said nothing. The machines around him hummed softly, the rhythm of his heartbeat filling the silence between them. He studied her face, memorizing every line, every shadow. She looked older, more fragile than he remembered, but there was still that same strength in her eyes, the kind that had drawn him in all those years ago. He wanted to tell her everything he'd never said, to apologize for every wound his world had left on hers, but words felt too small for the weight of it all. Instead, he just held her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, grounding himself in the simple reality that she was here. "You haven't lost us," she whispered suddenly, her voice breaking. "Not anymore." The words struck him harder than any bullet. He felt the tears burn behind his eyes, and he blinked them away quickly, ashamed of the weakness. But Elena saw. She always saw. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, her breath trembling. "You're still the man I fell in love with," she whispered. "You just forgot how to be him." Lorenzo closed his eyes, the sound of her heartbeat so close he could feel it in his bones. For the first time in years, the silence inside his chest didn't feel like punishment, it felt like peace. He thought of their son, safe somewhere beyond these walls, and a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the hospital blankets. For once, he didn't see the faces of the men he'd buried or the empire he'd built out of blood. He saw only her, and the small piece of hope she still offered him, even after everything he had done to destroy it. He wanted to promise her that he'd change, that he'd walk away from the darkness for good, but he knew she didn't need promises anymore. She needed proof. And maybe, just maybe, the fact that he was still alive was proof enough. He took a slow breath, his grip tightening around her hand. "You should hate me," he murmured. "I did," she admitted softly. "Every day. But hate doesn't last when the heart still remembers love." Something inside him gave way then, a quiet surrender that felt almost holy. He let out a slow exhale, his body sinking deeper into the mattress, his eyes fluttering shut, not from exhaustion but from a strange calm that washed over him. He wasn't falling asleep. He was letting go of everything that had kept him chained. The noise of the hospital faded to a hum, the pain dulled to nothing, and all that remained was her touch, steady and warm. For the first time in a long, violent life, Lorenzo Moretti felt human again, that he had bled for power, killed for loyalty, and lost everything for pride. But in this sterile room, surrounded by the ghosts of his choices, he had finally learned what it meant to love beyond fear. And as the sunlight crept across his face, chasing away the shadows, he let himself believe, just for a moment, that redemption might not be impossible after all. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of his heart monitor. A fragile symphony that seemed to echo every beat of the fragile hope between them. Elena sat beside him, her hand never leaving his, tracing slow circles against his skin as if afraid that if she stopped, he might vanish again. The world outside was waking, nurses exchanged shifts, sunlight slipped through the blinds. And the scent of rain still lingered in the air, but inside that small hospital room, time had slowed to something sacred. Lorenzo stirred faintly, his eyelids fluttering open, and when his gaze met hers, there was a softness that hadn't existed before, a quiet surrender that made her throat tighten. He looked nothing like the man who once commanded armies of fear. He looked like a man who had finally laid down his weapons. His voice came out rough but steady. "You stayed," he whispered, as if afraid the words might break her resolve. Elena gave a small smile, one that trembled around the edges. "Where else would I go?" she said, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "You may have ruined a lot of things, Lorenzo? But you never ruined what we were." He turned his face slightly into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment as if to memorize the warmth of her hand. "I thought I did," he murmured. "Every night, I saw your face when I closed my eyes. I saw what I did to us. I kept thinking, maybe I was never meant to love." Her eyes shimmered, and she leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. "You loved wrong," she whispered. "You let power teach you how to love with control instead of care. But that doesn't mean you can't learn again." He wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that redemption could exist for a man like him. But guilt was a stubborn thing, it didn't just fade because someone forgave you. His thumb brushed against her wrist, feeling the faint pulse there, a reminder that she was real, alive, close. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" he asked quietly. "Our son?" Elena smiled sadly, tears catching in her lashes. "He doesn't need to forgive you. He doesn't know your sins. To him, you're just his father. That's your second chance, Lorenzo. Don't waste it." Her words cut deep, not because they hurt, but because they offered him something he didn't know how to accept: grace. For so long, he had been defined by his sins, his empire, his violence. He didn't know who he was without them. He had built his name on fear, his power on blood, and his walls on pain. But now, looking at her, he realized that none of it mattered if he couldn't look into those green eyes, his son's eyes, and see something worth saving. He exhaled shakily, his fingers tightening around hers. "When I was bleeding out," he said, voice trembling, "I thought about you. About him. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to die. I was afraid I'd never get to tell you that everything I built meant nothing without you in it." Elena's lips parted, but no words came. She could only stare at him, the man she had once loved and hated in equal measure, now stripped down to something raw and human. A soft knock came at the door, but no one entered. One of Lorenzo's men had probably been standing guard outside all night. He ignored it. The world beyond that room could wait. Elena took a shaky breath, brushing her thumb over the back of his hand. "You don't have to be the man the world fears anymore," she said softly. "You can be the man your son looks up to." He gave a faint smile, tired but genuine. "That's the hardest thing I'll ever do." "Then start small," she replied gently. "Start by getting better. Start by being here." For the first time in years, he laughed, a soft, broken sound that filled the quiet like sunlight through cracked glass. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was close enough to hope. He leaned back against the pillow, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling as if seeing something far beyond it. "You know," he said after a long silence, "when I built my empire, I thought love was weakness. That it made men soft. But lying here, I've never felt stronger than I do right now, knowing that you stayed." Elena's tears finally fell, silent and unrestrained. She leaned forward, pressing a kiss to his forehead, tasting the salt of her own grief and relief. "Love doesn't make you weak, Lorenzo," she whispered. "Fear does. And you've lived in fear long enough." The words lingered in the air, soft but unrelenting. He closed his eyes again, not from exhaustion this time, but from the weight of something deeper, understanding. For years, he had fought to control every outcome, every threat, every loss. But this surrender to love, to forgiveness, was the first battle he had ever truly won. Elena sat silently, watching him breathe, her hand still entwined with his. For the first time since she'd known him, his face looked peaceful. The sharpness in his jaw, the tension that always lived between his brows, had eased. In its place was something almost boyish, almost innocent, and it broke her heart all over again to see the man beneath the monster. She thought of the years wasted in silence, of the nights she held their child alone, and she wondered if fate had always intended to bring them here, to this fragile, painful kind of healing. "Rest," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We'll figure it out when you're ready." He didn't answer. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and steady, but there was a faint smile on his lips, the kind that only comes when the soul has finally found a place to rest. Elena stayed by his side long after the sun climbed higher in the sky, her fingers laced with his, her heart beating quietly with the rhythm of his recovery. For the first time in what felt like forever. The world outside could wait, because in that small, quiet room, something stronger than fear had finally begun to live again. The months that followed passed like a slow exhale after years of holding his breath. As though life itself had decided that Lorenzo Moretti had finally earned the right to be still. The old mansion, once a monument to power and secrecy, had softened under Elena's touch. The marble floors no longer echoed with the clipped steps of men carrying orders, but with the soft patter of tiny feet and the rustle of morning light through open windows. The air smelled different now, of fresh paint, of brewed coffee, of life. Lorenzo would wake before dawn and watch the sun crawl up the horizon, its light slipping through the curtains and spilling over Elena's sleeping face. It was a sight he never grew tired of. She looked peaceful, free, her hand resting loosely near the edge of the crib where their son, Adrian, slept with his tiny fists curled like he was still holding on to dreams. Sometimes, Lorenzo just watched them breathe. There was something sacred about it, something he could never have understood back when his world was built on steel and shadow. He used to think strength came from control, from fear, from the way men trembled when they heard his name. But now, as he sat there in the silence of his reborn home, he realized strength could look like this: a heartbeat, a small hand wrapping around his finger. The quiet surrender of knowing he didn't have to fight anymore each morning carried its own kind of peace. Elena had taken to painting again, her easel set up near the garden where sunlight kissed the flowers he had never noticed before. She painted simple things: the sky after rain, Adrian's laugh, even Lorenzo's silhouette when she thought he wasn't watching. He often brought her coffee and just stood there behind her, watching the way her brush danced across the canvas, the way her brow furrowed when she was lost in color. Sometimes she would glance back and catch him staring, and they'd share a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. The house no longer needed guards at the gate or men patrolling the halls. His empire had been sold, divided, or given away. Every dollar, every weapon, every ounce of influence he'd once clung to like oxygen. There were moments when he caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The tailored suits had been replaced with soft shirts and worn jeans. His hands no longer smelled of gunpowder but of soil from the garden he'd started keeping with Elena. He laughed now. Genuinely, though sometimes it came out rusty. Like a song he was still learning the words to. The world outside still whispered his name in fear. But here, within these walls, he was simply Lorenzo, husband, father, man. One afternoon, the sky turned golden in that way only late summer skies could. And Lorenzo found himself sitting under the olive tree in the garden, Adrian in his lap. The boy's laughter bubbled like music, his little fingers reaching for the petals of a daisy Elena had tucked behind his ear. Lorenzo's chest ached with a tenderness he never thought he could feel. He brushed a hand through the boy's dark hair, his hair, and whispered, "You'll never know the man I was. Only the man I am." Elena was nearby, her canvas set before her, a faint streak of blue on her cheek where she'd brushed it absent-mindedly. She glanced up and smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that had once broken his heart and now held it together. "You've changed," she said softly, teasingly. He looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "No," he murmured, leaning forward to kiss her forehead. "You changed me." And in that moment, as Adrian squealed between them and a gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the garden, Lorenzo understood something deeper than words, that love was not about possession or control. It was about peace. Sometimes, at dusk, when the world fell silent and shadows stretched long across the lawn, Lorenzo would sit alone for a while, letting the quiet settle around him. He thought of the men who had once followed him, of the wars he had fought, of the ghosts that used to haunt these walls. He didn't regret leaving that world behind, but he carried it like an old scar, a reminder of who he had been and who he refused to be again. Elena would sometimes join him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders before sitting beside him in the fading light. They rarely spoke of the past anymore. It lived somewhere far away, behind them, in another life. What mattered now was this: the soft hum of crickets, the warmth of her hand in his, the sound of their son's laughter echoing faintly from the house. There were no titles here, no thrones to protect, no enemies to silence. There was only love, quiet, imperfect, real. And for a man who had spent his entire life ruling through fear, it felt like the truest kind of freedom. The days slipped into one another like brushstrokes of a painting he never wanted to finish. Each moment a blend of colors, laughter, sunlight, the quiet hum of contentment, and for once, Lorenzo didn't measure life in losses or victories, but in the gentle rhythm of ordinary days. He learned to live in small details, the smell of Elena's hair when she leaned close to kiss him good morning, the weight of Adrian's head on his chest when the boy fell asleep during afternoon naps, the sound of rain tapping softly against the window while they sat together in silence. Those silences used to frighten him. Once, silence meant danger, the calm before a storm or the breath before a bullet. But now, silence meant peace, the kind he had never known existed. Sometimes, when the night stretched deep and the house was still, he would walk through the corridors, remembering how they once echoed with power, commands, and fear. The walls that had once witnessed blood and betrayal now bore family photos and Elena's paintings. Her colors had replaced his shadows. The transformation was so complete that even the ghosts seemed to have laid themselves to rest. There were no more whispers, no more footsteps behind him, only the faint sound of Adrian's laughter carried from his dreams. Lorenzo would pause at the doorway of his son's room and watch him sleep, one small hand clutching a stuffed bear, his tiny breath steady and warm. It amazed him how something so fragile could hold the strength to anchor his entire world. That he had always thought that peace was something earned through conquest, through domination and control, but now he knew it was found in surrender, in letting go of the parts of himself that had once defined him. The man who once commanded armies now found his purpose in the simplest things, trimming roses in the garden, fixing the squeaky gate, learning how to cook because Elena once joked that he couldn't even boil water. He burned the first few meals and swore under his breath, but Elena only laughed, that soft, musical laugh that made the whole house feel lighter. "See," she teased. "You're human after all." And maybe that was the point. For the first time, he allowed himself to be human, flawed, clumsy, ordinary, and he discovered that love thrived in those imperfections. Some evenings they would sit outside, watching the sunset melt into the horizon, Elena's head resting on his shoulder as Adrian played with a small wooden toy on the grass. The world, once sharp and dangerous, had softened around them, and in its quiet, Lorenzo found redemption every now and then. Fragments of his old life drifted back, an old associate sending word that the streets were quieter without him, or a news article mentioning the fall of the Moretti Empire. It no longer stirred pride or regret in him. It felt like reading about a stranger. The name Lorenzo Moretti had once carried the weight of fear, but now it belonged to someone who no longer existed. He had buried that version of himself the night he chose to fight not for power, but for love. When he looked at his reflection now, he saw not a boss, not a ruler, but a man, a husband, a father, a soul finally at rest. The scars remained, of course, faint reminders of the chaos he had lived through, but they no longer defined him. They were simply stories written on his skin, proof that even broken things could heal. Sometimes, when the wind rustled the trees and the scent of jasmine drifted through the air, he could almost hear the echoes of the past fading into nothing. One afternoon, while the sun bathed the garden in gold, Lorenzo sat on the porch with Adrian asleep in his arms. Elena stood nearby, painting the view, the light on the flowers, the softness in his gaze, the small rise and fall of their child's chest. She worked quietly, her brush moving as though it were guided by memory rather than sight. When she finally looked up, she smiled, that same smile that had started it all, the one that had once melted through his walls. "You've changed," she said again, her tone gentle but full of wonder. He chuckled softly, his voice a low hum. "No," he whispered, leaning forward to press a kiss to her forehead. "You changed me." And in that simple truth, he found everything he had ever been searching for. He watched as she turned back to her canvas, sunlight spilling across her hair. And he felt something inside him settle, a quiet, certain peace. As the day faded into twilight, the three of them remained there, wrapped in the warmth of the evening. Adrian stirred and blinked up at his father, a sleepy smile curving his lips. Lorenzo brushed a kiss over his son's temple, and in that instant, everything he had once believed about power seemed absurd. He had spent a lifetime building empires of stone and blood, thinking that was strength. But this small, fragile, beautiful life, was stronger than anything he had ever known. It didn't demand loyalty or fear. It asked only for love. The sound of Elena's laughter mingled with their son's giggles as fireflies began to blink in the garden, and Lorenzo felt his chest tighten with gratitude. He looked up at the sky, streaked with the last traces of sunset, and whispered to no one in particular, "This is what it was all for." There was no need for applause, no legacy to chase. His empire now lived in the hearts that beat beside his OWN.AS. Night settled and the world turned quiet once more. Lorenzo carried Adrian inside and laid him gently in his crib. Elena followed, placing her hand on his back, and for a long moment they simply stood there, watching the rise and fall of their son's breath. It was a small, ordinary scene, and yet it felt infinite. When they finally turned off the light and walked back down the hall, Lorenzo paused, glancing once more at the walls that had seen so much hate, loss, redemption, love. He exhaled slowly, a deep, contented sigh that seemed to release the last ghost lingering inside him. "The greatest empire I ever built," he murmured. Looking toward Elena, was love. And as her hand found his, fingers intertwining with the ease of two souls that had finally found home, Lorenzo Moretti, once the feared Mafia Boss of New York, walked into the quiet night not as a man of power, but as a man reborn.